Well, welcome everyone. We will just wait another little minute for other people to join in, and then shortly we'll start this evening's presentation. Okay, well, we're just at 2 minutes past 7 in Central Europe here, so I will just kick off by first of all welcoming you and saying a big thank you to join us this evening. My name is Alex Marrable. I am the Managing Director of TutorsPlus. I have the pleasure of running this company for over 20 years now, and I'm so pleased that you've been able to join us tonight. So we're going to be talking about IB Results Day. The subheading you can see in front of you, stay calm, know your options. Well, it's easier said than done. In fact, this year I'm on both sides of the fence. Not only am I rooting for all of our students, but my son is also awaiting his IB results. So I'm sure you are also anxious. Maybe your student in your life is anxious or not anxious enough. But either way, we're going to be moving through some really hopefully helpful advice from Daniele, our university counsellor here at Tutors Plus. So just a quick introduction to Daniele, and then I will hand you straight over to him and we'll get into the meat of things this evening. So Daniele has been in education for many, many years, professionally as a university lecturer. And then the last 10 years or so, he has been doing university counselling. He's got a bachelor's from Berkeley, as you can see there, a doctorate from St Andrews, and not just those qualifications, but the many, many years of getting candidates into the top universities in the world has placed him in a really excellent position to give you advice this evening. Just on a personal note, I was so grateful when we got to work with Daniele because he's almost the unicorn of the university counselling world. He has experience not only with Europe, the US and all its complexities, but he also has significant experience of both the UK and the Swiss university sector, which is also rather unique. So enough from me. I'll now hand you over to Daniele, who will take you through this evening. Just one quick thing before he starts is I'll be monitoring the chat. So as questions come up, feel free to put them in the chat as we go through today, and I will feed them through to Daniele. There'll be a Q&A at the end for you to ask questions. So hopefully we'll get through as many as we can before we end this evening. Daniele, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. And thanks everybody for making it, and a warm welcome to IB1 and 2 and also non-IB families. Alex and my colleague Olivia were telling me of the varied background of the families that were listening in tonight. So hopefully everything here is in broad stroke applicable, right, to everybody who's in the room. And of course, there are things that are obviously going to be solely applicable just to the IB candidates. But I do also want to underline now, if you have specific concerns, questions, unique cases, I very much encourage you to drop a comment or a question on or in the Q&A box, right? I feel like everybody, especially me, could get probably the most out of today's presentation when looking at the nitty gritty here, right? The very finite and the unique to a specific individual. case. It really hopefully should ideally allay a lot of concerns that you might have going into results days. We all know they're nerve-wracking, no matter how confident or not so confident you might be going into it. So the overarching aim, I guess, for today's presentation is to do some of that calming of nerves as much as possible. How do we ultimately go about doing that? In part, it's kind of understanding what results mean and what, again, generally speaking, the impact would be for your son or daughter with reference to their particular university destination, right? So if they have their IB results, they intend to go to a UK university. What does it mean with regard to their firm and insurance, their first or second choice, on July 6th when the results come out? What does it mean by contrast if they're, intending to go on to a public or a federal university, right, in Switzerland? What does it mean if they're intending to go to a very specific university in the US? Um, the consequences will vary here. And at least at the very beginning, the aim is to kind of explain in broad stroke once more here what some of those consequences might look like. But I think one universal point I'd also like to make tonight is no matter how confident you are going into this, and no matter what your higher ed system or destination is, um, knowing your options, and I think with it further to that, having a plan B or an insurance policy here is going to be in your best interest. Okay. At the end of the day, hopefully it does that much more to calm those nerves just immediately in advance of the results. When you get in turn those results on July 6th, I'd like to think that everybody here is going to be informed about what their potential next steps are. And that is more than half the battle, I feel. So I've alluded to the different systems, the higher ed systems here, and the impacts that they're ultimately going to have these results, right? Depending on the system or university that the student is going to or intends to go on to, right? So we'll spend some time, and in fact, probably a lot of time, especially discussing the UK and clearing. We'll also touch upon European pathways and American pathways. We'll make probably one or two references as well to any alternate routes that might be on the cards here. But again, as I've said, if you have specific questions, I very much encourage you to throw them my way because I think, especially with regard to results, again, everybody's results are individualized. Accordingly, everybody's post-results next steps are going to be individualized. For better or for worse, there's no, one size fits all policy here. But nevertheless, hopefully, we'll get a very good idea of what, in general, we should be doing, depending on where we want to go in line with those results. So one of the best ways to kind of approach results day is looking at how a given destination or system, US, UK, continental, European, Swiss, um, approaches results, right? So if we use the UK, for example, to start with here, it's done through the application system, as we surely know, is done through the application process, excuse me, is done through a centralized system. In turn, universities get back to students with, in most cases here, conditional offers, right? They've yet to finish the IB in this case. So let's say Oxford is going to say, hey, congrats, yes, you could come to read history on, the condition that you get a 41 overall with 766, for example, at higher level. Okay, great. Now, flash forward to results day, right? And what ultimately will Oxford in particular say if you're a few points shy? So we'll touch upon that. Within the UK system, of course, I added here a column for flexibility level. I generally call it a medium sort of to probably high. I would also add here a medium to, sorry, low level of flexibility. I used Oxford to start with because they will be probably the most strict when it comes time to determining whether or not they should accept you if, say, you were to fail, right, to meet their conditions. But Oxford is just one university among many. And so Oxford's internal policy to failing to meet a condition, right, could vary, well, could be grossly different, for example, to what, say, even UCL or KCL down the road in London, right, have to say in the case of a student failing to meet their conditions here. Okay. So it's worth very much bearing that in mind when we go into results day, that especially with regard to the UK here, and maybe no one's going to like me saying this, um, things on the whole are definitely going to be especially strict. However, we cannot say with absolute certainty here that every university employs the same policy with reference, right, to the conditions either being met or having failed to be met here. What we do in turn, right, once results are released and we are in negotiation or discussion is probably the better word here with a UK university. Well, again, we'll also get to that. There is maybe some wiggle room here, some leeway. Okay. Even with, say, your firm or your first choice, excuse me, during this window, this gap, maybe is the better word here, of time between when IB results come out on July 6th, right? And when A-level results come out in mid-August, right? Now, for some people, that might be an especially nerve-wracking time, but it does at the very minimum give you actually a few weeks to explore perhaps what your options might be, as maybe a UK university is considering whether or not to accept a student, say in the case that they failed to meet, right, an offer here. So I want to start with the UK, just because whilst it seems to perhaps be quite flexible, it's arguably almost the most complex of the systems here. Um, Hopefully, what I say next sort of underlines that point. So again, broadly speaking, with regard to the US, in line with their more holistic view, right, of applications, and with it, I should probably go out and say, sticking my neck out here, that many Canadian universities operate on the same policy here, under the same policy, although there's probably going to be one or two exceptions, like a Toronto, for example, and especially if we're talking about cases where, again, we're looking at very hotly sort of selective courses or programs, maybe with, say, like computer science, for example, in mind, or physics or engineering. Again, there, a certain university might be particularly explicit. You must have a certain grade, in an AP, in an IB, what have you. Okay. But on the whole, in general, again, talking in broad stroke here, US and with it, many Canadian universities are actually going to be rather flexible here. How flexible? Well, it kind of depends, but half flippantly, I oftentimes say, just get over the line, just pass. And more than likely, you're going to be okay. I think on a more seriously, what I would say is, so long as there's not a major gap. I know that's kind of subjective, sort of what that means exactly. But say, for example, you're predicted a 39 and you get even a 34, right, or a 33. In most cases, certainly based on my experience, even including the very top universities across the US, those universities are going to be perfectly okay with that, right? We'll get back to maybe one or two sort of maybe secondary consequences, right? That you have to keep in mind, especially with the US, in that, okay, well, maybe Harvard has accepted me, right? Even though I didn't get a 39, 40 plus. However, because my higher levels maybe were especially low, that will have or could very much have an impact, a negative one, when it comes time to Harvard looking, again, this is any university, let's just say Harvard here as an example, what they might ultimately determine you can or cannot take from the IB and apply towards university or college credit, right? It's kind of complicated. Again, if we wanted to go into further detail on that point, I'm very happy to do that in the Q&A. But just with the main focus here being on, hey, I have a result. Maybe it's not the one I expected. Am I going to get in? Most American universities are going to say, sure. Okay. Europe, and this is way too broad, I understand, and forgive me, I guess, the Italians and to the Spaniards, to the French, etc. here. But again, here too, to use maybe a prime example, if I may, the Italians very notably would say, well, with the IB, so long as you have the diploma, so a 24, right? You're going to be okay. So, I mean, that's an extreme case in that you could be predicted a 40, but hypothetically, in fact, in most cases, I don't think I've ever experienced this firsthand, but by Italian law, so long as you've ultimately graduated with the IB diploma in hand, and say you're going to even a private university like a Bocconi, they would accept you with that. Okay. By contrast, the Swiss are ultimately going to be, well, say the public ones have a bare minimum, right? It's 32 or 34, sorry, off the top of my head now. There are certain ways around it if you fail to meet a particular benchmark or overall. Depending on the university, right? There could be a foundation route, for example, here. But even there, there's actually some leeway. Again, so long as you meet that minimum threshold of the mid 30s, you're going to be okay. So if I may, the main takeaway from this slide, and very, very roughly and very quickly here, trying to sort of differentiate general attitudes or approaches, right, that different higher ed systems have on IB results, especially if you come under your expected grade, it's the UK is probably going to be the most, probably the biggest stickler, right? They're going to say, well, you know, you're a point or two off, sorry, right? It could happen. In fact, it does happen a lot. The US, very unlikely, unless you are 10 plus points, I would say, often, you know, away from what was expected of you. In Europe, it does vary, but many, again, even by law, it's enshrined so long as you ultimately graduate with that particular diploma. That's considered the equivalent of any national diploma that is allowed to that offers a resident the opportunity to start their studies at university. You're going to be fine. Private universities within these systems do vary case by case, right? I know we have one or two questions about, say, for example, IE Madrid. I know I mentioned Bocconi as well. It might be helpful, perhaps then at that point, maybe during a Q&A. You know, they could ultimately, well, we can get into those, okay? During the Q&A here. So let's move on. I've been spending a lot of time on this one slide here. What do we do, right? What do we do if results are lower than expected? Because I guess that's the gross concern. That's the main concern that we have today, right? Um, these are, I tried to sort of put down, well, okay, what are the sort of like the universal steps, no matter your position, right? No matter where you're also applying. And so the common pitfalls to avoid, for example, are panic calling, right? Don't rush to call universities without a career plan or a clear plan, excuse me. There's a couple of reasons for that. Where universities ultimately hear you out, literally, they will expect you to get on the phone, for example, and explain your situation. If you don't have a firm idea of what exactly has happened, whether there were mitigating circumstances, perhaps that were not revealed, or maybe didn't, you know, or came to light, or maybe some issue that happened during the testing itself, or something that happened. Well, anyway, it's worth explaining to that university. And again, if you're not prepared to at least underline that point and be very clear in ultimately what were those mitigating circumstances, right? Then we might be missing out on a clear piece of evidence, let's say, that could indeed have an impact on a university hearing you out, right? Also, and maybe a very practical point. I mentioned earlier that window or gap between IB results day and A-level results day, right? And many universities, especially in the UK, on here, are simply just going to sit on IB results until A-level results come out, which is, I would say, especially nerve-wracking. So calling up, more than likely, you're just going to have the immediate bounce back. Yeah, we're sorry to hear that, but we're going to ultimately weigh up everyone's results when they come out and make a firm decision or a final decision on results in August. Some universities are, in a way, helpful in that, especially selective ones, based on my experience. So, like LSE immediately comes to mind, the London School of Economics. I've seen where you have obviously falling short of your offer, for better or for worse, they're pretty happy to turn around and immediately reject you. Okay. So in a case like that, there's really no, I would say, immediate recourse. Unless, of course, again, you have mitigating circumstances, you're going through a retake or the EUR, formally speaking, process here, and you are able and ready to calmly get a hold of that university and say, hey, I know that you've made this petition here through UCAS to reject me, but wait, hear me out. Well, you want to make sure that your account, right, your story checks out. So take that extra time because, again, usually you're going to have a considerable gap here between when results come out and when a university, in this case in the UK via UCAS, is going to be making any sort of formal decision on your on your application to them. Alex, is that a hand from you?
Yeah, there's a little
Yeah.
question here from Jennifer, and she's asking that although, as you say, the US offers aren't conditional, they reserve the right to
Yeah.
reject you if your IB scores
Yeah.
don't meet it. So she's asking, how do you handle this with the Ivy Leagues and specifies that Columbia is notorious for doing this. What's your advice?
Yeah. Good question. So again, here, right? The approach or the attitude is they're going to be flexible, but again, let's not well, I have a certain phrase. I won't, use it here. Let's not just, assume or be especially casual about, and particularly at the very top level, how a university is going to read the fact that you're, say, several points short, right? Is that here's the following. If indeed, again, actually, this harmonizes with what I was just saying in relation to contacting UK universities if you have a story, an account, and some sort of explanation, particularly with reference to the IB here, it's worth providing it, but of course it needs to be coherent, right? So at the start, you need to explain, well, what ultimately might have happened, what difficulties perhaps were you facing, etc. Yeah, will it actually, make a massive impact? Not formally, especially if it's not filed as a formal mitigating circumstance. But again, having that extra background would definitely help a US university. Another thing to do, and I know it's something that I certainly do with a lot of students. I underline this point considerably and often is just because you finished your exams doesn't necessarily mean that the process of getting into university finishes, say, come May, early June, for example, for most students, right? To be in a position to show a university, especially an American university, that you have a number of things going on, academic or otherwise, during the summer, can, in addition to obviously highlighting maybe other achievements, your SAT scores, other, say, if you did Olympiads, competitions, essays, external achievements, right, academic in particular that were awarded, anything of the sort that you could point to, say, for example, that wasn't that came especially in addition or on the heels or after you had applied and a decision was already made. Hey, we love this, student A. Well, and it so happens that student A didn't get their IBs, as predicted here. Well, if student A has continued, right, to develop and win and sort of beef up their resume or CV, ideally, they would then in turn present that information to a university because beyond the IBs, in line with the broader holistic sort of ethos, right, and philosophy, I should say, that an American university has, they could be, dare I say, rather forgiving here and say, okay, well, yeah, IBs didn't work out, but look, we still have a candidate here that's showing so much academic and, say, personal potential. So again, be prepared with all that information and do indeed have that discussion with a university, especially American universities, in my experience, can be flexible, even at the top tier. Can they still turn around and say no? Yes, of course they can, right?
That's
But
such a
at
great
least
point.
there's your fighting chance.
That's such a great point, Daniele. And obviously, you and I know of examples where decisions have been turned around by that, you know, exceptional projects that happen in the summer that build on that application. Jennifer just comes back. We're going to have to move on in a second, but just a quick one
Mhm.
that US don't truly understand the IB. So sometimes that leads to problems with them converting it into US grades, which we know is the case and it's an ongoing struggle. Do you have any advice on, is there anything you can do if you get a result that's below the offer?
Uh, I mean, so in an ideal world, right? In an ideal world, a student is applying from a school, and I know that probably schools might not necessarily like this, that is when it comes time to filling in their side of things in the application. So, namely, say transcripts, the academic records that get passed on to a university, a very good stroke smart school. is going to do quite a lot in putting together, say, an academic or school profile. And that includes a very lengthy explanation of the IB, in addition to any others sort of qualifications and projects and whatnot that the school has provided for this student and everybody else. So they're actually doing a lot of heavy lifting, right, for a student on their behalf. In an ideal world, if a student, sorry, if a school does that, right, in my experience, I would say that most university admissions officers are going to be especially up to speed, not just with, say, the IB results, but generally speaking, right, where the student is coming from. And for that reason, on the broad point of, hey, are they still showing they have the ability, etc., to come here? Yeah, they're going to be pretty happy, right? Where things get kind of messy, I've seen, and I did again allude to this point a few minutes ago, is not so much when it comes time to determining whether or not you're accepted, but say when it comes time to then during the matriculation process as a freshman, and say you're talking to an advisor at that university, um, whether or not they're going to take your higher level, let's say it's a six, right? And say, oh yeah, say your higher level six in maths AA, yeah, that's the equivalent of, a four or 4.5, kind of borderline, where does it ultimately fit for someone who's, say, done AP Calculus BC, right? There is ideal in most universities nowadays. Thankfully, though, what I've seen more and more is there is a clear-cut kind of rubric that's used, and they say, okay, well, roughly speaking, at least an AP Calc 4 is the equivalent of an HL, say, 6, right? And vice versa. And they're kind of gonna go on that. But every university, and we're literally talking about thousands, especially in the US, right? Every university is going to be different. And unfortunately, there, I would say you're sort of left at the mercy of that given university and their familiarity with the IBO. Now, if we were having this conversation maybe like 12 years ago, I would have been the first person to say, oof, be prepared if the school hasn't ultimately said everything there is to know about the IB, then make sure that on the day of results, you have your IB results. Sorry, the IB, you've memorized it back and forth. You could basically be a de facto representative for the IBO itself, to make sure that, say, an American university fully understands what your qualifications are, how demanding they were, how rigorous and how ultimately, in line they are with, say, their American equivalents, especially at AP level, right, advanced placement level. Um, I think more and more we're seeing that students don't have to do a lot of that heavy lifting or footwork, right? That many universities, especially at the very top, right? Your top 50, I would probably go so far as to say your top 100 in the US, for the most part, they're going to have nowadays a very, very good understanding of the IB and be able to sort of swiftly translate that's not the right word, evaluate here ultimately what an IB score is in relation to, say, an American counterpart grade. Um, Kind of moving on here through the slide, the other common pitfalls to avoid is ignoring options, right? So again, it's having that plan B, right? Now, the UK in a way makes it easy for you because it insists a little strict. Well, okay, let's just say for the sake of argument, it insists that you have to have a plan B, right? If you have multiple offers, you have a firm or your first choice, but then you could also put down your insurance. Your insurance almost always is going to be a university that has offered you, extended a conditional offer that is lower than that of your firm. In the case, in the case that, say, your firm wanted a 39, you got a 37. Your firm turns around and says, no, we don't want you anymore. Your insurance says, well, that's cool. We only needed a 36, so you're in, right? So that's really helpful. And it's always worth double checking exactly what your firm ultimately wants out of you. But also think of, at the risk of overthinking things, what if my insurance, what if I fail to meet my insurance, right? And I ultimately do find myself homeless, so to speak, here. Well, thankfully, nowadays, especially what I've seen is in the UK, at least through the clearing process, clearing the site goes live I would say 4 days. I think it's July 2nd here. It goes live a few days before results are released. And why is that important to mention now? Because even though it's not the final exhaustive list, you do end up seeing a lot of universities publish their courses that they are very confident are going to have places, right, through the summer into for the fall, right, starting in the fall in this case of 2026 here. So you could start brainstorming and doing your research and saying, well, look, like what if in a worst case scenario I have a 34, you know? And I know my firm and insurance are both going to say no. Well, who's out there that's currently considering 34s? And start putting together, that list and be prepared, to potentially get in touch with them, right? As I said, I think even with the US, there it's if you know that you've had, obviously they don't operate in the same manner, right? You have your one choice. Yeah, you got in, you had to turn around and say, sorry, I'm not coming to everybody else. But again, what happens, if a Harvard does rescind an offer? Well, here too, right? Work with what potentially you might have and with what you do have, because always keep this in mind as well with regard to the Americans. I would say the bulk of the assessment of your academic ability is made on what you've done to date. It's what you've achieved and not with what you're predicted. And there's a whole other story we could get into, a discussion we could get into there. But in this situation, it actually helps because you could be prepared and point to your positives, right? Up until this final year of the exams, I had X, right? I got this SAT score. I have these external qualifications, et cetera, et cetera. And see in turn, well, is there any recourse, right, to get back in touch with another university? I know it's especially late. Or, and again, something else to obviously consider here as well is what, if any, possibility is there to either retake and or take a gap year as part of maybe a retake plan? And we'll get into that. But again, use this opportunity through July in particular here, right? Certainly this first week and into the rest of the month to start, projecting and saying, well, look, if I have failed to meet my offers, right? What worst case scenarios, what could I possibly do? I mean, there's always going to be ideally some constructive plan B or plan C here for you, okay? And then the family pressure, understanding how parents react. I mean, hopefully there are a lot of, parents here today and being just as informed or clued in as their sons and daughters goes a long way. I genuinely feel here, right? So if they understand, well, look, I know that say the clearing site opens a few days in advance and we have potentially weeks here to start doing our research, to see ultimately what my alternatives are for the UK. And or I could start looking into American universities that potentially might consider somebody super late, right, into the summer. And or let's start exploring, if we haven't already, what a retake, combined with or as part of a gap year might look like. There's no harm in having those conversations now, because at least between now and results day, you're looking at things maybe in a bit more measured of a fashion, right? A bit, certainly calmer, I would say, hopefully. Immediate steps, what do you do? Stay calm, right? The conditional offers, again, this is especially UK focused. I touch back on the US as well here. But on the whole, I would say that even with regard to the European offers, again, if you're looking at like i.e. Madrid, maybe there it's, you know, put together your account, right? Take a step back and say, how do I explain to somebody who doesn't otherwise know me beyond my scores and beyond my dossier, right? My academic dossier here, what has happened and who I am? And make sure that you have that account ready before you approach that university, like especially a private university, and start having that conversation. Well, look, I didn't get my, the grades here. What's your policy? So an IE, for example, is a good case of someone that says they're fairly flexible and lenient, right? To students missing the mark to a point, right? And I think with that in mind here, it's going into that conversation with them and again, highlighting all the other positives that, especially with IE in mind, right, made for a very good application as part of their holistic application review. that ideally would indeed increase your chances, right, of getting that leniency, of getting that, acceptance here, right, by a university that otherwise wouldn't necessarily or doesn't necessarily have to accept you. Right. Um, right. Okay. So the remark, I mean, this is can be pretty sticky, but and I might be coming at this from quite a conservative, I would say, angle here. But it's worth spelling out anyway. Yeah, remarks we use it's a EUR, right? Is the acronym, especially for the IB, but not just. They can make sense, but every case is unique. Number of things we need to keep in mind here, right? If it's a borderline, maybe one or two, points off a particular grade, right, from a 6 to a 7, or even a 5 to a 6 or 4, whatever it may be, is it worth exploring? I would say in most cases, it's worth having at least that conversation with the school. Now, to kind of speed up that conversation, you need to be asking yourself things like, is this a point or two off of, say, a math, right? Or is it physics? Or is it maybe English, for example, or history, right? So what we've seen in the past is, and this is pretty, I mean, understandable, right? Where, say, more STEM focused, right? Maths and science focused subjects are going to have a fairly sort of black and white or clear cut, you know, a policy or to assessing you, right? You either have the right formula, you don't, that's the right number, or it's not, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot more subjectivity with regard to, say, assessing someone's art or history essays for you, right? Or their English literature and so on and so forth. And so there we oftentimes do get higher success rates, right? If a school and the IB coordinator and or the more specifically, that student's teachers say, well, look, a point or two off, but to be honest with you, I think you did make a good point here. It's well worth bringing this to the IBO. Yes, you know, that's the encouraging sign, right? That's that evidence that you need to say it's well worth doing. Most of the time, these remarks can are fairly quick. You have a few weeks, especially through July into August, so make the most of it. But definitely be prepared, and indeed double check with your own school if you haven't already here, right? What is their own internal process to having that EUR, that remark conversation? Okay. So that you're not kind of scrambling around or making phone calls or emailing the wrong person on the day that the results come out. Because your first port of call is going to have to be with the school, right? Have that conversation and in turn see whether or not there is a case here. All right. Thankfully, right, as regards risks and timeline, at least with risks, it's I still say pretty rare that someone goes in with a 5 thinking, oh, I definitely deserved a 6 and walks away with a 4. It happens, but thankfully not as often as maybe someone might expect. With the timeline as well, again, quite anecdotally here, I would say though that remarking EURs, again, formally, they do happen fairly quickly during the summer. The IBO is a well-run, organized machine here. So, they are looking very seriously at each case that's presented, by way of a school on behalf of the student. And rest assured that whether it's 1 week or 3 or 4, the results that they come back with, are indeed going to be, carefully deliberated on, reviewed, and indeed, decisive. The good thing as well here is if indeed fairly quickly you and the school arrive at a decision to send for an EUR, right? One of the first things subsequently, right, you need to do is turn around and get in touch with the universities that you're speaking to, right? Say, for example, it is an IE or a UK university, an American one in particular, right? And say, by the way, these are my results, but I'm getting a remarking here, right, through the school. We're going through the formal processes here for, say, A or B subject, right? And the sooner you do that, the sooner you buy yourself that much more time. Because the last thing you want to do is kind of leave maybe a really bad set of marks or grades here um, unaccounted for, right? Unanswered, undefended. And so if a university gets them and they don't hear back from you subsequently, they could indeed turn around very quickly. I mentioned LSE, for example, in the UK and say, all right, fine, obviously you missed your marks, that's that. But if you knew, say, within a day or two of the results coming out that, look, you were going to get one or two subjects remarked here, then in turn, one of the first things you should do is get in touch with LSE and say, I understand that you're not going to be able to come out, maybe say, with a formal, unconditional offer, right? You're still going to weigh up, my grades in line with, say, A-level students, etc. But before you do make your final verdict here, please know that I am getting one or two multiple subjects, remarked. And indeed, in almost every instance, right, they would give you that extra time through the month of July into early August, usually, to let the process run its course, and in turn hear back from you, right? So is it ultimately worth it? I think, again, every case is ultimately different. I think usually in the humanities and the arts, the broader social sciences, especially if it's a point or two off, well worth ultimately doing. Okay. Your school, though, and your teachers know you best. So first port of call, school. They should be prepared, right? If and to allay concerns here, over the next couple days, if someone's around at that school, get a hold of them and confirm with them, well, hey, what do we do, right? Post results day, who do we contact here? Who's the person that we need to speak to if indeed we want to go through this remarking process, right? The sooner you know that, again, the quicker you can move through things. And I think here there is that bit of time sensitivity. You want to get this out to the IBO as soon as possible so that you in turn could then notify universities, hey, hold fire. There might be a chance I could still get my mark in, right? On that point, a separate point here, actually, beyond remarking, the question of retaking, right? It can get a bit messy. I mentioned IE, for example, earlier. They're pretty flexible when it comes time to say being a few points shy. Again, so long as you be prepared, explain your situation, focus on the positives in your application, even things that you've achieved since your application was accepted. Okay. However, in IE, like some other private universities, um, sort of the flip side of things, they're not at all happy with retakes, right? So retaking, you would decide, well, I'm going to resit in November, for example. Many universities are going to be okay with that. They're going to be saying, amongst other things, well, at the very minimum, you're going to have to defer for, the next application window, but you're still in with a fighting chance, for example. Or as part of a gap year, they're still going to be very happy to consider retakes, knowing that they are indeed retakes, that they weren't your first set of results. But not every university is like that, right? So I should very quickly kind of clarify there that an IE Madrid, yeah, they're going to hear out a remark, but they won't necessarily be very happy to entertain a resit. Now, that's a bad case. Let's focus on good ones. Many, though, can, especially if maybe these resits form part of a gap year and you're going to retry for the next application cycle. Um, by all means, it makes perfect sense to do so. I would say, especially in the US, they are far less judgmental. If anything, they're very happy to hear and indeed applaud that, approach, the kind of like, falling down, getting back up, right? Pulling yourself up from your own, with your own, by your own bootstraps, excuse me. Um, and going again, right? And of course, if indeed that is your pathway, then naturally it's well worth saying here that, at Tutors Plus, we would indeed, be able to sit down with you as a family, assess ultimately your position, assess ultimately the strengths and weaknesses, and in turn figure out, okay, well, here's a decisive, clear-cut action plan, right? A tuition program between now and the time that, say, a resit is in progress here, to know that if indeed you are either going it alone and or only have minimal school input as a retake candidate, you definitely otherwise have a very strong academic cover here, right? Say by way of private tuition. So it's definitely worth mentioning this now. And again, if you wanted to discuss retakes, because they oftentimes form part of much more complex and certainly much more unique to an individual cases of, say, a gap year, I'm very happy to discuss that during the Q&A. Um, Very quickly, if results exceed, expectations. They used to be called adjustment in the UK. For the US, I think you're just going to be happy where you are. All right. And if the one positive and maybe constructive thing to highlight is beyond the diploma and the fact that you obviously you're going to be going to your top choice is say maybe you were thinking of you might have only had fives and sixes, especially at higher level, but in turn you actually got sixes and sevens. Well, don't, make a lot of noise here. Don't be quiet. The second you get your results, get in touch with your university and point out to them, look, can you just or confirm here what your policy is with regard to IB higher levels being awarded college credits, right? Maybe they have something, a handbook to hand, they could forward to you. Otherwise, they might say, we don't have anything set in stone. It might be, again, determined on a case-by-case basis, but keep this in mind and make sure that you bring this up to your advisor when it comes time to putting together your first year of courses. So better than results, better than expected results, even in the US market, could ultimately mean college credits that you weren't expected. In the UK, again, through clearing, it's all called clearing now. It could mean, hey, you know what, I'm going to, I was expected to go to, University A, that's maybe, out of the top 10 in most typical rankings for this course. But look, I got better than expected grades, and it just so happens that they have that same course or a similar one open during clearing, right? Um, you know, it's worth coming to them. If anything, like you have leverage here, and they'd be chomping at the bit. Many universities, especially outside, say the top two or three, to ultimately extend, to accommodate you dropping for your previous universities that you otherwise identified as your firm and insurance to go to them. Scholarships could also happen. Sometimes they're kind of like a nice surprise. Again, US market, UK too, if it's academic, although not as generous. So it's worth looking at. And again, here, maybe something to bring up during the Q&A. So I imagine, because there were quite a number of questions, the best thing to do is kind of open it up to the forum here and yeah, answer again, much more specific, hopefully more relative or relevant, excuse me, questions that you guys might have.
Yeah, so Daniele, thanks for that. So I'll just
Hmm.
jump back to a couple of questions that came in earlier. So for the UK, for the first offer, can you make the case and appeal to the first choice offer if you haven't made the grade, the marks for that offer, even though in the UK system you're automatically accepted if you make the insurance by your insurance offer? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. There's this like this window of time where you really need to strike. Um, but unfortunately, your firm, right? Let's use concrete examples here. They kind of hold all the cards. Let's say you have like KCL, you want to read law, you want to go study law, right? The LLB. So you have law, for example, and KCL offered you a place there, and KCL is your firm. And say your insurance was Queen Mary, right? You still want to make the appeal to KCL, even though you didn't necessarily get the grades. Well, UCAS does not, on the day of results, automatically adjust for you, right? Or the university. They wait to hear back from the university. The university, your firm, KCL in this case, is going to have the final decision, right? Get in touch with them. I had a case last year, right? Someone who fell a few points shy and also didn't necessarily have a very strong LNAT. That's the law aptitude test that KCL demands, amongst other universities. But she was doing a hell of a lot in between and running a society and picked up a lot of work experience and already did her IELTS academic to ensure there was no delay with regard to the visa when it came time to, handling that side of things. And even though formally speaking, KCL wasn't going to weigh in, they said, well, we're still going to weigh up, take our time here. I'm sure because they did acknowledge and were grateful for the additional information that the student was producing here, it bought her time. It, beefened up her case. And did it go some way into KCL saying, hey, I know you fell a few points short, but we still want you? I'd stick my neck out and say yes. Now, why do I use that case? It's just to confirm here, KCL, the firm choice here, they ultimately decide. They so often don't decide the day IB results come out. So often, many of these British universities, are going to wait until A-level results come out anyway, right? So mid-August. So that gives you that much more time to kind of like, present your case before the university does come out. And the other thing to keep in mind is this: if indeed you are in communication with your firm, um, ideally, in fact, typically what happens is that that university will kind of give you a day or two heads up as well when they do come back with their final decision before UCAS is updated. So that also gives you maybe a day or two to kind of do some thinking. Well, do I want to go to my insurance? Should I turn around and tell my insurance actually, never mind, release me back into clearing. I'll take my chances elsewhere. There's moments here where you could ultimately have some wiggle room to figure out what ultimately is going to be the best course of action.
Great. Thanks, Daniele.
Mhm.
So the next question is US based. How quickly will universities turn a conditional offer into an acceptance in North America after results day? Now,
Ye-
North America, I don't know if this person is talking about the US and Canada.
So, I mean, that's the thing, right? So, strictly speaking, like most American universities don't present your offer in terms of conditional, unconditional, right? That's quite a British thing or a UK style. So, most offers are sort of like, you're in. And then, of course, like any good contract, you read the T's and C's, and there's, this option to sort of rescind the offer, right? When do they ultimately make it official? That's great. You sometimes, in cases like this, literally just need to get in touch with them and ask them to just, even if it's an email, state in writing, absolutely, we're happy with the way, we're fine with this. Thanks for letting us know. It's not going to impact or, negatively here or slow down the matriculation process, right? And any, say, related visa process. The good thing about the US, I've seen over the years is, unlike the UK, for example, a university is they're not going to wait on other qualifications like A levels to come out before coming out with their, say, final verdict. If you have a suspect IB result and you want to get clarified once and for all with your university whether or not they're still going to be happy with you, they're going to decide on that very quickly, right? And in cases like that, it's worth absolutely just getting that written confirmation from them. Yep, all things considered, thanks for letting us know. We're still happy. Continue on. So
Great.
that's roughly, I think, the best way to sort of answer that question.
So another US orientated question from
Mm,
Jennifer. So we need to let UK universities know about remarks being requested. Is the
mhm.
same advice for the US?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And the US is always, so with the US, excuse me, the US, most American universities are always going to have throughout a better line of communication with students, before, but especially after applications are submitted and even after the application has been decided on and say you're accepted, right, at a given university. And this is why, as I was saying earlier, keep in touch with them. Like, be the needy boyfriend or girlfriend, right? And just tell them, like, look at me, don't forget about me. This is what I did, and this is great. And, so another thing, I did. And, oh, look, here's an updated CV or resume. Oh, by the way, I'm still expected to finish here. And, with as head or captain of this, society or this athletic club, or even like with sports, right? Again, it doesn't have to necessarily be academics. Keep an American university informed, especially about what it is that you're doing. And all of this goes a very, very long way, I feel, to when it comes time to those like very sort of pivotal moments. Well, I got my results. I can't hide from them now. Um, what are they going to say? They'll normally be quite happy with someone like you because you've shown them on the whole, look, you're great, and you really want to be there, right? So I mean, and
Okay,
that,
so
yeah.
so we've got a few more questions, so we'll just race through these final ones before in the last
Mhm.
5 minutes. So Alina asks, can a better than expected result open chances for a UK university that didn't provide a conditional offer?
Yes and no. So some universities, the easy part of this answer is some British universities, especially the very top tier, rarely have any course through clearing. I think like Oxford came out with a course, maybe it was in the arts or something a few years ago, and it made national news. Um, Most aren't. going to have that. So your Oxbridges, for example, LSC perhaps might have a few UCL and KCLs, right? Those outside of London, like your Durhams, St. Andrews, etc. They might have, so additional courses, right? It's well worth looking at. Um, and with these universities, I would say here that um, it's sorry, Alex, I've just lost my train of thought. The precise question was what exactly?
I think you've already covered it. It was just that whether you can, if you get a better than expected
Yeah,
result, whether you
that's
can
it.
go to a conditional offer for someone that hasn't offered to you.
Yes, so they're definitely going to have the spaces. Thank you, Alex. What I wanted to say is this very quickly. So long as you did not, now this is the complicated part. So long as you didn't apply to that same university's course during your original UCAS application, and in turn sort of either were rejected or didn't take up their offer, then you could definitely approach that university so long as it has a course open and is considering you in your IB profile and ask to be considered during clearing. Okay.
Great, very helpful. Now, this is one that I think is worth a little discussion of because we didn't talk about this in too much depth. But Mishak is asking, how should students decide whether to accept their results or request a remark? And importantly, we had a discussion in the chat that obviously the
Mm.
remark could result in a lower mark, which then becomes your actual mark.
Yeah. Yeah. And it can, and I say there, I mean, it does happen. Again, I don't speak for anybody else but myself, and so often now it's been obviously as a private advisor, it does happen where students, depending on the subject, right, they do apply for a remark and they get, lower than expected. And that's disastrous. Now, I would hope, though, that any good school, IB coordinator, teachers that are supporting the family and the student would have a very frank and honest, conversation with that student during that initial conversation. Isn't EUR even worth it, right? Because they could look and say, look, there's a very big risk here, depending on the subject, depending on, what we see, that you could ultimately get, especially lower than predicted. And again, normally a good school is if they come out and say that you should, listen to what they're saying. Okay, it's where they look at a case like yours. Again, so often I've seen this, especially where say in the more, dare I say, subjective analyses, right, like of essays, whether it's history, English, etc., where they might say, do you know what, actually, look, I think there's probably some wiggle room here. Someone who maybe who didn't wake up on the wrong side of the bed, they're going to have a more favorable interpretation or understanding of what you're trying to say here. And yes, it is worth doing. But every case is different. Every subject is going to be different. And there, in almost every instance, I do say, I do defer to an IB coordinator and a specific school set of teachers to determine whether or not the student actually has, the grounds, and the
Yeah.
evidence to put in that request. Because again, you don't want to find yourself in an even worse situation than you did on results day, but hypothetically that can happen.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniele. So we're now running out of time. We've just got 1 minute left. So I'm just going to ask you to give a yes/no answer to this one, Dan.
Yeah,
I'm assuming it's better for the student to call the university rather than the parent.
always,
Yes, that's an easy one.
always, always, always. In
So
fact, parents should never call. Parents should
yeah.
never call.
So there are some more questions here, but I don't think we have time to get to them. So perhaps we can answer them individually by email, Janet. I've
Mm,
seen there's a couple from you and Jennifer too. So we'll see if we can just drop those back to you by email. And so I'll let Daniele just wrap up today with his final slides, just to thank him for his time today, to thank you for joining us. Hopefully this has been a useful time for you.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Yes, I know I rushed through a number of things, and I think, among other things, all that underlines, as I said from the start here, was it's a pretty complicated affair. Every case is unique here. And one thing that, I would certainly be happy and indeed encourage you to do if you wanted is to sit down, go over in a lot more detail your son or daughter's case. look over reports, look over maybe, let's say maybe immediately after results came out and say, for example, you might already be in discussion with schools, right, regarding a retake. Maybe you're thinking about, a remark, excuse me. Or you're perhaps thinking, or retake's worth it, or gap year's worth it. What impact will they have ultimately going forward here? I very much encourage having taking the time, if you wish, to book in a call and discuss your individual case in depth. Because, I appreciate it's a very important and serious matter, and it's a very pivotal time in everyone's life. And you really want to make sure that you get the steps right here, right? Um, and if you're the ones who could sort of smugly look here at everybody else and say, well, I don't have to deal with results. Maybe I'm IB1, for example. Well, okay, but you're here for a reason. Maybe you're thinking about the big picture. You're thinking about uni preparation. Where do I start? Whether or not it's worth, having that extra support. And if that's the case, then again, here too, I do also encourage, booking in a call. Now, for non-results, right here, there's a free initial 30-minute consultation. This would just be to kind of get to know each other, discuss your case, what plans you might have, what current situation you're in academically and otherwise. And again, just kind of underline perhaps where, we might be able to help, what sort of advising packages we offer here for you guys. Yeah, so I encourage either form of communication here, guys.
And
And want to thank you very much for your time.
lean on your IB
Yes.
diploma DP coordinators, lean on your university counselors, because we work with a huge network of them, and the parents and families that shout loudest get more of their time. So that's just one bit of advice from our side. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. We'll end the event here, and we'll speak to you again soon and follow up on those final questions via email. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.